Ancient Egypt looks like a story about eternity. Golden pharaohs, pyramids built to outlast time itself, temples carved with the promise that this civilization would last forever, guarded by gods who never died. That's the picture most of us grew up with. Kings who ruled as living gods. Monuments so precise they still confuse engineers today. A kingdom so wealthy that even its workers, according to legend, were whipped into building tombs for men they'd never meet. But that version leaves out something important. The pyramids weren't built by slaves under the whip, and Egypt wasn't one long, unbroken golden age. It was a civilization that collapsed, starved, tore itself apart, and rebuilt itself again and again for 3,000 years. The real story of ancient Egypt isn't about permanence. It's about how a state kept convincing its own people that the world was stable, even while it kept nearly falling apart. From the throne room, the kingdom looked eternal. The pharaoh sat as the living embodiment of Horus, the guarantor of something the Egyptians called Ma'at, cosmic order, balance, the idea that as long as the correct rituals were performed and the correct king sat on the throne, the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, and chaos would stay outside the borders. From the workers' village, it looked very different. Ma'at wasn't just a religious idea in ancient Egypt. It was closer to a political operating system. Every temple relief showing a pharaoh smiting an enemy, every hymn describing the king as the son of the sun god Ra, existed to reinforce one central claim, that the entire universe stayed balanced because this one man sat on this one throne. Break that claim, even briefly, and you weren't just questioning a ruler. You were questioning the mechanism that supposedly kept the sun rising. Take the artisans of Deir el-Medina, the elite, literate craftsmen who spent generations carving and painting the royal tombs hidden in the Valley of the Kings. These weren't unskilled laborers. They were paid in monthly grain rations, supplemented with fish, vegetables, beer, and firewood, and they lived in a walled, state-built village on the west bank of the Nile. In the 29th year of the reign of Ramesses III, around 1157 BC, their payment didn't arrive. It was late by more than a week. Then it was late again. State granaries were being drained to prepare a lavish jubilee festival for the pharaoh, even as the men who built his eternal resting place waited without food for their families. 18 days after their payday passed with nothing, the workers put down their tools and walked out. They marched past the necropolis guards to the mortuary temples of Ramesses III and Thutmose III and staged what modern historians now call the first recorded labor strike in human history, chanting that they were hungry. From the palace, this was a scheduling failure, a bureaucratic hiccup fixed with a diverted grain shipment. From the village, it was proof that Ma'at, the divine order the king was supposed to personally guarantee, was breaking down in front of the very people building his path into eternity. Which version was Egypt actually living in? The eternal kingdom carved into temple walls, or the fragile bureaucracy one bad harvest away from men marching on the pharaoh's own temples? Let's actually put this into numbers, because this is where the scale becomes difficult to ignore. Ancient Egypt's population is estimated to have hovered somewhere between 1 and 5 million people for most of the dynastic period, almost entirely packed along a narrow ribbon of farmland fed by the Nile River. That means nearly the entire civilization depended on a single point of failure water source. If the flood came in on schedule, Egypt fed itself and thrived. If it didn't, there was no backup. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, built around 2560 BC, contains an estimated 2.3 million limestone blocks. For centuries, the popular story, first written down by the Greek historian Herodotus around 450 BC, claimed it took 100,000 slaves 20 years to build it. Archaeological excavation of the purpose-built workers' village at Giza, however, has uncovered bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, and cemeteries where laborers were buried with honor near their king, and bone analysis shows they were eating substantial amounts of beef, an expensive meat many nobles couldn't regularly afford. Modern estimates put the core rotating workforce closer to 20 to 30,000 paid laborers, not 100,000 chained prisoners. Herodotus's claim of a 100,000-man workforce laboring for 2 decades wasn't just an exaggeration. Modern Egyptologists argue it likely reflects a Greek traveler working from second-hand stories more than 4 centuries after construction, repeating whatever local guides told him, rather than any surviving Egyptian administrative record. Now compare that to the reign of Pepi II, who ruled for somewhere close to 90 years around 2278 to 2184 BC, one of the longest reigns in recorded history, and then compare it to what came immediately after his death, a series of Nile floods so low that harvests fell by as as much as half, plunging the kingdom into the chaos historians call the First Intermediate Period. This is the first thing to understand about ancient Egypt. The story isn't really about a civilization that achieved permanent stability through divine kingship. It's about a civilization that built an extraordinarily convincing performance of permanence on top of a system that was, structurally, always one bad flood away from collapse. An empire built along a single river isn't a guarantee of eternity. It's a bet that the river keeps its promises. If you're enjoying this breakdown, this is a good moment to hit subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel keep making these. If the official mythology of divine, unbroken kingship explains the surface of the story, then the actual distribution of power underneath it explains what was really holding Egypt together, and what kept threatening to pull it apart. Officially, all power flowed from one source. The pharaoh, seen as the earthly form of Horus and, after death, joined with Osiris. Temple inscriptions describe the king single-handedly maintaining the balance of the universe. Everything from the Nile's flood to Egypt's military victories was framed as a direct consequence of the pharaoh correctly performing his sacred role. The crown was the symbol of power. The system underneath it was the real story. Politically, that image was never entirely true. During the Old Kingdom, regional governors called nomarchs were originally royal appointees, but over generations their positions became hereditary, and their loyalty shifted from Memphis to their own local dynasties. By the time Pepi II died, nomarchs in provinces like the one ruled by a man named Antifi were openly boasting on their tomb walls about personally feeding the starving and clothing the naked, describing themselves, not the pharaoh, as the ones holding chaos back. Economically, the entire system ran on grain, not currency. Coin money didn't exist in Egypt until the Persian and Greek periods, centuries later, so taxes were collected in kind: wheat, barley, cattle, linen, and redistributed through state and temple granaries to pay officials, soldiers, and skilled workers like the men of Deir el-Medina. That meant the pharaoh's entire administration was, in effect, one enormous logistics operation for moving and storing food, and any disruption to that supply chain hit the government's legitimacy directly. By the later New Kingdom, the temple of Ammonius at Karnak alone controlled enormous estates, herds of livestock, fleets of ships, and workforces numbering in the tens of thousands, making its priesthood arguably wealthier and more powerful than some kings who nominally ruled over it. Gold financed the empire, but grain controlled it. The human cost of this system becomes visible exactly when the system failed. During the First Intermediate Period, a text known as the Admonitions of Epure describes a kingdom in collapse, lamenting, in a line historians still quote today, that the river had turned to something undrinkable while men lined its banks with thirst. Tomb robbery, always a background crime in Egyptian history, spiked dramatically whenever central authority weakened, because starving communities and unpaid guards had far less reason to protect the dead. And the long-term consequence of this instability wasn't a single collapse. It was a pattern. Egypt didn't fall once. It fell, reorganized under a new centralizing dynasty, expanded again, and eventually cracked again, through the Old Kingdom into the First Intermediate Period, through the Middle Kingdom into the Second Intermediate Period, through the New Kingdom into a long, slow fragmentation that ultimately ended with foreign rulers on the throne entirely. Egypt wasn't one civilization that lasted 3,000 years. It was several Egypts, wearing the same religious costume, rebuilding the same myth of permanence every time the last version of it fell apart. But this is where the story becomes much more complicated, because holding the myth together came with real, accumulating costs. First, there was the climate cost. Modern paleoclimate research has linked the Old Kingdom's collapse to what scientists call the 4.2 kiloyear event, a severe, decades-long megadrought that struck across the Mediterranean and Near East around 2200 to 2150 BCE, and which coincided with catastrophically low Nile floods recorded at Elephantine. Egypt's genius was building an entire civilization around one river. Egypt's vulnerability was building an entire civilization around one river. Second, there was the cost of forced religious change. When the pharaoh Amenhotep IV renamed himself Akhenaten around 1348 BC and declared the sun disk Aten the only god worth worshipping, he shut down temples to Ammonius across the country, erased the god's name from monuments even in distant Nubia, and relocated the entire capital to a newly built city in the desert. Correspondence from this period, known as the Amarna Letters, shows foreign vassal states pleading for military help that never arrived, because Egypt's attention had turned entirely inward. Third, there was the cost of the backlash. Within a few years of Akhenaten's death around 1336 BC, his own successors, including the boy king Tutankhamun, abandoned his new capital, restored the old gods, and began systematically chiseling Akhenaten's name out of history, a practice called damnatio memoriae. His reign was so thoroughly erased that it took modern archaeology to even reconstruct what had happened. Fourth, there was the cost of unpaid labor and broken trust, the same tension that boiled over at Deir el-Medina, a warning sign. Historians now argue that the informal contract between the Egyptian state and its skilled workforce was fraying by the end of the New Kingdom. And fifth, there was the compounding cost of foreign pressure arriving exactly when Egypt was weakest. Waves of invasion and migration from groups like the Hyksos, and, centuries later, the mysterious coalition known as the Sea Peoples, who struck the eastern Mediterranean right as Egypt's grain economy was already strained. Egyptian inscriptions from Ramesses III's reign describe repelling these Sea Peoples in a major battle around 1178 BC, but even a successful defense drained the treasury and the labor force that would otherwise have gone toward farming. Exactly the years when the Deir el-Medina rations began arriving late, the empire could look eternal because, for most of its history, its costs were being paid somewhere else, by provinces, by workers, by whichever generation happened to be alive when the Nile finally failed to rise. And if you think the Deir el-Medina strike was the most dangerous moment in this story, what happened 4 centuries earlier was even more consequential, because it nearly ended Egyptian civilization altogether. After Pepi II's extraordinarily long reign ended around 2184 BC, the Old Kingdom's centralized government effectively disintegrated within a generation. The lowest Nile floods in centuries hit repeatedly through the following decades. Modern strontium isotope studies of Nile sediment confirm what the ancient texts describe: flood failure on a scale the agricultural system had never been designed to survive. Grain reserves emptied. The admonitions of Epicure describe cities burning and the dead left unburied. Language historians debate as either eyewitness reporting or later literary exaggeration, but which nonetheless captures a genuine memory of catastrophe. Rival power centers emerged at Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south, and Egypt effectively became 2 competing kingdoms for well over a century. The nation everyone thinks of as the land of eternal pyramids had, within a single human lifetime, fractured into civil war and famine. It would take until around 2055 BCE, when a Theban ruler named Mentuhotep II finally reunified the country, for anything resembling the old order to return, meaning the gap between the fall of the Old Kingdom and the rise of the Middle Kingdom lasted roughly a century and a quarter, longer than the entire lifespan of most modern nations. Historians still debate exactly how much of this collapse was driven by climate versus political failure. What the evidence agrees on is that both pressures hit at the same time, and that a system built entirely around predictable annual flooding had no real contingency plan for a drought that refused to end on schedule. The version of Egypt people remember is the temples and the tombs. The version that actually happened first was ordinary Egyptians burying their dead in mass graves during a famine nobody in power had prepared for. So if the flood-dependent, Ma'at-based system had worked, on and off, for well over 1,000 years by this point, why did Egypt's entire model finally begin to change? The answer arrives with the Hyksos, a group of West Asian origin who settled first in the eastern Nile Delta and, by around 1650 BC, had established their own ruling dynasty at Avaris, controlling Lower Egypt while native Egyptian rulers held on in the south. For an isolated river kingdom that had rarely faced serious external military threats, this was a genuine shock. The Hyksos brought technology Egypt hadn't fully adopted: the horse-drawn war chariot and the composite bow. When the Theban prince Ahmose I finally expelled the Hyksos around 1550 BCE, founding the 18th dynasty and the New Kingdom, he didn't just reclaim territory. He inherited their military technology and used it. Before the Hyksos, Egypt was largely a defensive, insular farming state. After them, Egypt became something closer to a militarized empire, with a professional standing army, chariot divisions, and ambitions that stretched from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. The old world of isolated river valley kingship didn't vanish overnight. It was replaced, piece by piece, by an Egypt that now had to think like every other Bronze Age power around it. In terms of borders, alliances, and armies, this new, imperial Egypt had genuine advantages over its neighbors. By the reign of Ramesses II, Egyptian armies could field thousands of chariots and tens of thousands of infantry, backed by a wealthy grain economy that smaller Near Eastern kingdoms simply couldn't match. At the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, fought against the Hittite Empire in modern-day Syria, Ramesses commanded roughly 20,000 troops in one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history. A battle so strategically inconclusive that both sides claimed victory, and which eventually produced what historians consider the earliest surviving peace treaty in the world, signed around 1259 BCE. Smaller states and vassal kingdoms around Egypt survived this imbalance of power not through matching military strength, but through diplomacy, tribute, and marriage alliances. The Amarna letters, that same archive from Akhenaten's reign, contained desperate correspondence from Canaanite city-state rulers begging Egypt for troops, gold, or simply attention, using flattery and appeals to loyalty because outright resistance against Egyptian and Hittite power was rarely survivable. Ordinary Egyptians experienced this imperial power differently than the vassal kings writing letters from Canaan. Most adult men owed the state a period of compulsory labor, known as corvée duty, which could mean farming royal land, working in mines and quarries, or serving in the military during campaign season. This wasn't slavery in the chattel sense, but it also wasn't optional. It was a tax paid in time and effort rather than in grain, and it fell hardest on peasant farmers, who had the least ability to refuse it. Power doesn't always belong to the side with the biggest army. Sometimes it belongs to the side that knows exactly how to survive underneath one. The disruption that made this new imperial Egypt possible wasn't just political. It was technological, and the hidden consequence went far beyond warfare. The war chariot, introduced by the Hyksos and mastered by the New Kingdom Egyptians, wasn't simply a faster way to fight. It required an entirely new economy to support it: horse breeding, specialized craftsmen, chariot workshops, and a professional soldier class trained from a young age rather than farmers conscripted for a single campaign season. That shift changed who held status in Egyptian society. Chariot officers became a distinct, prestigious military class. It changed labor patterns, pulling skilled craftsmen away from temple and tomb construction toward weapons and vehicle production. And it changed foreign policy entirely, because a kingdom that could now project force hundreds of miles from home had every incentive to start doing exactly that. Egyptian tomb paintings from before the Second Intermediate Period rarely show horses at all. Within a few generations after the Hyksos were expelled, chariot scenes dominate royal monuments, temple walls, and even toys recovered by archaeologists. A visual record of how quickly an entire military culture can be absorbed once it proves it works. New technology didn't just change how Egypt fought. It changed what kind of state Egypt needed to become in order to keep fighting: richer, more centralized, more militarized, and far more entangled in the affairs of distant kingdoms than the isolated farming society of the Old Kingdom had ever needed to be. That same entanglement, though, cut both ways when the system underneath it cracked. For most of Egyptian history, the relationship between the state and its workers operated on an unwritten understanding. Laborers performed their duties, and the state, acting through the pharaoh's obligation to maintain Ma'at, guaranteed their food and payment in return. This wasn't formal law in the modern sense, but it functioned as one of the oldest documented labor contracts in history. The Deir el-Medina strike broke that understanding publicly on the record for the first time. According to the Turin strike papyrus, officials eventually negotiated and released emergency grain to end the protest. But historians who study the site note that the underlying relationship between the state and its workforce never fully returned to its earlier, unquestioned form. The idea that maintaining Ma'at was solely the pharaoh's private responsibility had cracked. Ordinary workers had shown they could, and would, publicly hold the state accountable when it failed. The precedent changed first. The surrounding belief system took much longer to catch up. That precedent mattered because it reveals something larger about how ordinary Egyptians shaped their own history, not just as farmers and laborers absorbing decisions made above them, but as people who resisted, negotiated, and occasionally forced change. Scribes preserved records through periods of political collapse that might otherwise have erased them entirely. Communities, like Deir el-Medina, maintained craft knowledge across generations of the same families for roughly 4.5 centuries, from the 18th through the 20th dynasty. Priesthood safeguarded religious continuity through invasions, civil wars, and even Akhenaten's attempted religious revolution, ensuring the old gods returned the moment central pressure lifted. The entire point of studying ancient Egypt isn't only to understand what pharaohs decided. It's to understand what ordinary people did in response, what they preserved, what they demanded, and what they refused to let disappear. Put three consequences of this history together, and the connection to the present becomes clear. First, the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs, made possible by the Rosetta Stone after its discovery in 1799 and Jean-François Champollion's breakthrough in 1822, didn't just unlock ancient texts. It created the entire modern discipline of Egyptology and, with it, a global tourism and heritage economy that remains one of modern Egypt's most significant economic sectors. Second, the core agricultural and population geography of ancient Egypt, that same narrow ribbon along the Nile, still defines where the overwhelming majority of Egypt's population lives today, more than 3,000 years after the pharaohs. Third, the very idea of a centralized bureaucratic state, one that taxes in a common system, maintains state granaries, and justifies its authority through religious legitimacy, appeared in Egypt among the earliest large-scale examples in world history, and it became a template later empires would study and adapt. Even the modern discipline of monumental architecture and engineering still measures itself against Giza. Structures precise enough that their true construction methods remain debated among specialists. Even with the workers' village evidence now available, the past didn't disappear. It changed shape, and in Egypt's case, it's still visible from space, still walked by millions of tourists a year, and still buried under the same sand that swallowed it the first time. Egypt's rise, when it came, looked unstoppable. The New Kingdom, from roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, produced an empire with unmatched wealth, monumental construction on a scale the ancient world had rarely seen, and military reach from Nubia to the Euphrates. Contemporaries had every reason to believe this version of Egypt would last forever, exactly as its monuments promised. Only a few things needed to go wrong for that confidence to collapse. Grain shortages, worsened by military strain against groups like the Sea Peoples around 1178 BC, drained state resources precisely when Ramesses III needed them to pay his workforce. The same crisis that triggered the Deir el-Medina strike. Succession disputes, including a documented harem conspiracy that may have led to Ramesses III's own assassination, weakened royal authority from within. And declining central control gradually handed real power to the Ammonius priesthood and, eventually, to a sequence of Libyan, Nubian, Assyrian, and Persian rulers who each, in turn, sat on the Egyptian throne. After Ramesses III's death, Egypt never fully regained the singular authority it had held under earlier New Kingdom pharaohs. By around 1070 BCE, the country had effectively split again, with a high priest of Ammonius ruling the south from Thebes, while a separate line of pharaohs governed the north from the delta. A divided kingdom in every sense but name, foreshadowing the centuries of foreign rule that followed under Libyan, Nubian, Assyrian, and eventually Persian control. That gap, between a power that looks permanent from the outside and a power that is already cracking from the inside, is the entire hidden history of ancient Egypt, replayed across 3,000 years. So here's the full picture, beginning to end. What looked, from the temple walls, like an unbroken golden age of divine kings and eternal monuments was actually a civilization that kept rebuilding the same performance of permanence, generation after generation, every time drought, invasion, or its own internal fractures nearly tore it apart. The real forces shaping Egypt's history weren't gods maintaining cosmic order. They were rivers that sometimes failed to flood, workers who eventually refused to stay silent, and a government that survived as long as it could convincingly promise both. That performance finally ended on the 10th of August, 30 BCE, when Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of a Ptolemaic dynasty that had governed Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, died in Alexandria following her and Mark Antony's defeat by Octavian at the Battle of Actium the year before. With her death, nearly 3,000 years of native and near-native Egyptian rule ended, and Egypt became a Roman province, prized above all for the one thing it had always relied on to survive: its grain. The pyramids survived. The pharaohs didn't. And the world underneath both of them changed almost beyond recognition. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to Gunovate for more hidden history, forgotten stories, and the darker side of the events that shaped our world.